Now I get to introduce probably two of the wisest and kindest people I've ever met. The first one is Carol, Carol Dunham, who I literally kidnapped off a plane. I sat next to her, and her energy was so incredible. I just could not talk to her, and she's become a dear friend, married us, done so many things in our lives. So very grateful she's here with us. And she's an extraordinary human. She's a medical anthropologist, an author, documentary filmmaker, and I love her words of how she describes herself exploring human entanglement with other species, from microbes to yaks. And she has lived in Nepal for 30 years. She's a lifelong student of Buddhism, Tibetan medicine, Himalayan medicinal plants. But I think one of the things that I love most about Carol is that she's so deeply committed to Indigenous peoples, and also the stewardship of fragile ecosystems and how those two connect with one another. And that's her deep passion. And she's also co-founder of an amazing organization called Around the World in 80 Fabrics. So make sure you check that out. And excitingly, she has been a dear friend of Wade's for many years, which is why we have them in conversation today. And Wade is an anthropologist, an author, a photographer, a filmmaker, an ethnographer, a professor at the University of British Columbia, and many other things. Like Carol, he's also a National Geographic Explorer. Wade has written a mind-blowing list of 25 books. His latest one is now out, called Beneath the Surface. So hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about that today, and you can get that book now. Many of you will have seen his TED Talks. They've been viewed over 8 million times in the world. And if I sat here and tried to talk about all his honors and awards, it would literally take up the full hour. But I just wanted to close on his introduction because I love David Suzuki, who's also a hero of mine, description of Wade, where he says, Wade is a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and a passionate defender of all life's diversity. So massive welcome to Carol and Wade. And I just have to say, I was saying earlier that I just feel this warmth of looking at Wade's background, because I sat in that room with you both for like 6 hours. And I've been amazed by your friendship and your partnership. And so I thought we could start just asking both of you to share a little bit about how the partnership started and why that's important in both of your lives.
I'll be happy to start because it's this form of just complete mutual love and admiration. I mean, Wade has always been, he's more of a mentor. I usually joke that like a rooster in the wake of a peacock, but his generosity is his core. And that's why we love him so much. He is the most extraordinary storyteller you'll ever meet. And we spent time up in the Himalayas storytelling together, and we were working on projects. Wade brought me in. There was a one called the Tibetan Mind Sciences, way up in the Himalayas, spending a day waiting for helicopters to come in, with Mathieu Ricard, who's considered one of the happiest people on the planet. We've been up in Mongolia, looking at where I worked with nomads for over 20 years, and exploring the relationship of humans and horses. But it's Wade's insatiable curiosity and his willing. What Wade does is so ironic. I think anthropology, as we know, came out of anthropology came out of colonialism, and many people talk about observation. And Wade is the opposite. It's about connection, and it's about connecting to people in the deepest and most profound ways. And that is how our relationship. I'm just one part of Wade's wide mycelium network of friends and family all over the world. And nothing gives me more joy and honor and love than to be considered a close partner and friend of Wade Davis.
Well, Jean, we could talk about each other, I suppose, all hour. Carol's way too modest. I think of her as a bodhisattva of the Himalaya, of everything. And when I first met her a long time ago, and in a fleeting moment at the Harvard Peabody Museum, and within a second, she had a kind of a charisma. And I've come to think of it as sort of the eroticism of the mind. Her mind is so fertile, and so curious and so original. and so open that it is a big part of her presence in the world. But also when you combine that with a bodhisattva heart, who is literally only thinking of doing good in the world, the combination is irresistible. And I don't know anyone who's ever met Carroll who isn't not simply impressed, it's not the proper word, overwhelmed and dazzled by her entire being. And so just to be in her presence, I find, is always a joy. And she's also underestimating her contribution to those projects. We made 2 films together, one in Mongolia on the traditional Nadam horse race of initiation, but more profoundly with Mathieu Ricard, the Buddha Science of the Mind, for the Geographic. But also Carroll was instrumental in the research for my book Into the Silence, a sort of 12-year effort to tell the story of the early British efforts on Everest through the, looking back both through the lens of their experience of the climbers in the Western Front and the agonies of the Great War, but also telling the story in a sense for the first time from the Tibetan perspective. And that whole world, Carroll opened up to me. So she is both a wonderful person, but also an incredible scholar, whose mind lands always on new and fertile ground.
But can I just say, I never stop learning from Wade. I mean, Wade is really, no one is more articulate at taking very complexity and communicating that. And I really, when we think about ecology or virtues or whatever the heck that means, there's a lot of complexity in there. And so I think we can be grateful to have Wade with us on that journey, because it needs some deep thinking. And what I love is Wade is so not afraid to speak his own truth. And even when that truth is a truth that is not necessarily popular or is not sort of politically correct, there is a refreshingness to his authenticity. And that's really what I love about Wade.
Well, I think ideology is the enemy of curiosity, and it's the enemy, just as orthodoxy is the enemy of originality. And we live in a world torn apart by ideology. And out of that comes nothing, in my opinion, but intolerance and all the things that have plagued humanity. So I like to sort of see the world as it is, not as I think it should be.
And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I feel like the sense of bridging divides and bringing us back together again is so important, and holding that space of respect for people you may disagree with is so important. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But one question I just wanted to ask you both to start is, because you both just demonstrated the beauty of reciprocity, of generosity, of love, just in your introductions. And I think people mistakenly think we make ourselves, when in reality, it's the people we surround ourselves with who make us who we are. And you two have sat at the feet of some of the people that have known this for centuries, of Indigenous peoples who have this deep sense of connection and collaboration, almost in the way that they are as human beings. And I'd love just to open up with a question about what you've learned from them, and what all of us can learn from the people that you've shared life with, these Indigenous cultures, about connection and about collaboration.
Well, if I could jump in, Jean, I think the key word you said was reciprocity. In our, something like climate change may have become humanity's problem, but it wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by a narrow subset of humanity that achieved great things. And in our desperate need to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith during the Enlightenment, we invented and conceived the scientific method, which has given us untold wonders. But at the same time, we threw out all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, but critically metaphor. And we deanimated the world in a single phrase by Descartes: science would make a house cleaning of belief, as Saul Bellows said. The triumph of secular materialism became the kind of very conceit of modernity. And invariably, we began to see the world around us as just an inert mass. And I remember as a kid in British Columbia working in some of the toughest logging camps on the coast, and what we were doing to that forest in retrospect, we could only have done if we had completely denied its vitality, and that is in effect the way that the Western tradition has largely interacted with the natural world, a kind of extractive model. And ubiquitous and all powerful as that may seem to be, it's highly anomalous in the ethnographic record, which makes very clear that reciprocity is the driving mechanism for human interactions. Some fundamental iteration of the idea that the earth owes its bounty to people, people in turn owe their fidelity to the earth. People are never seen as a problem by indigenous cultures. People are the only solution, because it's only through the human consciousness that the power of the earth can become spiritually manifest, right? And so you see these gestures of reciprocity and ritual all over the world. Um, and 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 so, you and I and Carol, raised in a world to believe that a forest exists to be cut, will be profoundly different human beings than those raised to believe that it's the domain of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven, the cannibal spirit. And the issue isn't who's right and who's wrong. It's how the belief system mediates the interaction between the particular culture and that natural landscape, with profoundly different consequences for the ecological footprint of the people. I was raised to believe a mountain is a pile of rock ready to be mined. Well, that made me different than my godchildren in the Andes, raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct their destiny. Again, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about the consequences of the metaphor.
Beautiful.
It's the story, we, as Wade says, it's the story that we've been raised on, and there's a profound, time right now. It's we here in the West that have to change our story. We think from the age of exploration, what has been our relationship, right, to this so-called innate? We see it as inert earth rather than as a vital or living. What is our actual relationship? Is it, as Wade says, Apu? Is it Mother Earth? Is it mountain, Father Mountain? Is the river? What is our, if it really is kin, and we return to a relationship of kinship with all things. So and when we talk of virtues and of humans, really, it's really what is our relationship to all things, and of expanding that. If you think for a moment, we in the West have been deprived so tragically for so many years of so many other intimate relationships and possibilities with the wild world, with that which even the unseen or the non-human world. And so radically reconstructing that. I mean, remember that 6% of the world's population is indigenous, and yet over 80% of all biodiversity on this planet, they are stewards of. After even we have taken over so much of the land and water and moved them to what was so-called marginal, and yet they have now actually, there's so much that it's we that have to consider how we're going to transform how we actually live on this planet, and radically our stories have to change.
Well, and the way we've marginalized indigenous people, of course, is by invoking that 19th century notion of derived from Darwin, that if species evolve, so do cultures, and therefore we created this fantasy that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized to the Strand of London. Well, that's been completely debunked by modern science and shown to be an artifact of a distant century, no more relevant to our lives today than the notion that clergymen had then, that the earth was just 6,000 years old. I mean, the two great scientific illuminations in our lifetime will be, of course, Apollo going around the dark side of the moon and seeing for the first time in humanity's vision, an Earthrise, not a sunrise, not a moon, but the Earth itself transcended. But the other one has come about more recently, and that's also a journey into space, but into the very fiber of our beings. And genetics has proven it to be true, what Boas intuited in his elaboration of the notion of cultural relativism. The genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Biologically, race is a total fiction. we're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all descendants of the same roots in Africa. But here's the important thing. If we accept that scientific truth, which it is a truth, then it means that all human populations share the same genius fundamentally. And critically, how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of choice and adaptive inclination. So there is no hierarchy. And what this means is that every culture has something to say and each deserves to be heard. The other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And the reason these voices matter, as Carroll just intimated, is that not to suggest that we abandon all the brilliance of modernity, or that we ask anyone to give up their right to have access to the best of modernity. It's to recognize that our way is not the only way. And this puts a lie to those of us within our tradition who stubbornly say that we cannot change when we all know we must change the fundamental way in which we inhabit the planet. And we are changing, and much of this is the gift of anthropology. We live in the social realm of the dreams of Franz Boas. It's interesting, Jean, if you want to those who are pessimistic about the pace of change need only consider the values of their great-grandparents, even their grandparents. There's not one thing your grandmother believed in that you would agree with. In fact, much of what she believed you'd find to be morally reprehensible. And the world that we've crafted is a world of our imagination that came out of a place of social justice and liberation. And so if you think it's normal for a Asian girl to have a Jewish boyfriend, or for a Jewish girl to pursue the Buddhist Dharma, or for two women to be great mothers as long as there's love in the home. And if you think that, we preserve jam but not culture, and if you think that every religious aspiration is a legitimate spiritual desire, as long as it does no harm, well, then you are a child of anthropology. So the world is changing. I mean, in my lifetime, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. If you had asked me in the 1970s whether men and women loving each other, whether two men would ever be able to become betrothed legally at the altar within a cathedral, in my culture, I would have said it would be impossible. But look what happened.
Mm. I want to go back to something that you guys said before too, which links way to the beautiful framing that you just gave of how we are cut from the same cloth. Yet we are so deeply divided right now and fearful of one another. The latest Edelman Trust Barometer, they asked a question of if someone had differing views than you, but they were in need, would you help them? And over 70% of people said they would not help someone in need if they had differing views. So I'd love to hear from both of you about how do we learn from Indigenous cultures about how we come back together again? And Carroll, you talk often about deeply listening and about holding that space for disagreement. And I'd love to hear from both of you about how can we bridge right now and what can we learn from Indigenous people who have, again, held that space for their lives?
Well, these are complex questions. The issue of humans and our ability to overcome our tribalism, and we think about interconnectedness. I mean, we're theoretically the most connected as a species that we've ever been in our lives through our technological devices. At the same time, perhaps we're the most disconnected from nature and the world that we ever have been. So how do we reconnect ourselves together? As you were saying about the space holding space for conflict is a huge part, and that is what I was trying to say earlier about stories. Is when we hold our stories so tight they have no windows in them. Who is the other? Who is the other to us? And so we look right now at some of the conflicts around the world in the moment over land and our ability to coexist, cohabit as a species amongst each other, let alone, with this mass extinction, the destruction of how many animals in the last 20 years that we have just had in just that short moment, is we humans, we aren't listening to each other right now. I think that there's probably been there's a deficit of learning how we can listen, how to just be with each other. We're in an age, an era of distraction. As for myself, having studied Buddhism for so long, they always talk about poor Buddha under the Bodhi tree, and there was Mara, distraction, coming in all its dancing forms. And now we just have a little phone that has hijacked our nervous systems. So we're losing the plot. And the plot, we really, humans, we are herd animals. As someone who has lived 20 years with nomads in Mongolia, in horse herds, we're no different. We actually are herd animals. But how do we get ourselves all onto the same page? And how do we help to hold that disagreement or the differences or uniqueness? I mean, Wade speaks more beautifully than anyone I know about the toxicity of the myth of the individual. And, how do we make a sense of conception of self that is based on ecology, that we're part of a larger ecosystem that not only includes other humans, but also other sentient beings and other plants and animals, the whole story. Because actually, if you could look at it in one way, we're in conflict with them as well. So how do we listen to our mountains? How do we listen to our landscapes? How do we listen to the birds? How do we listen? Because with the mass decrease of species and animals, it's important that we listen to all of them. And so I think that's really is where these old-fashioned virtues, I love that you have spoken about, virtue is a complicated word, isn't it? Because it means manliness or moral excellence, qualities. And sometimes we think of people that are just a little too virtuous. But when we think of some of those beautiful things of, generosity or ethical discipline, patience, joyful effort, meditative concentration or wisdom, these are what we call our Buddhist core ethics. These, if we can work on, the question is, do we impose ethics upon us, or are these that are part of our natural nature and that are just that are hidden and need to be revealed to us? Can we tap into what essentially already is who and what we are? And if with that, perhaps then the fear and these other parts, the larger anthropology has struggled since the beginning of time. Are we nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes would say? In other words, is this where what we're seeing right now in the world, where it's a very small percentage of greed that is literally with the petroleum worlds that we've created, that is destroying the climate? And how can we make small little radical revolutionaries that shift to change and make that turning point? So conflict is something that actually starts internally. And so as we hold on to stories really tightly, so how can we create windows in our stories, I think, and doors is very important. Wade, I'm going to lead it over to you, but that's a little bit I'd like to share.
I think you have to remember that, we're all in the West products of the Enlightenment, and the notion that phenomena that could not be measured and observed couldn't exist. So the notion that the flight of a bird could have meaning was ridiculed, dismissed as ridiculous. And at the same time, we struggled to liberate the individual from the tyranny of the collective, but that was a sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. And you gain great personal freedom and mobility, which the United States is the epitome, but you give up the comfort of community. And I think it's important not to romanticize Indigenous people. I don't even like the term Indigenous because it implies a uniformity to culture that ethnography rejects. There are 6,500 cultures in the world that by anthropological definition would be said to be indigenous, but to label them indigenous is to imply there's another group that's non-indigenous. And that creates a completely false dichotomy that fundamentally is no different than the odious notion of the primitive and the civilized that was accepted in the early years of the 20th century. every culture is a unique product of its own history. And we do see in indigenous cultures certain mores that are often the reflection of adaptive imperatives. So, for example, in a nomadic society like the Penan and Sarawak, sharing becomes an automatic reflex simply because you don't know who is the next to bring food to the table. I once gave a cigarette to an old woman in an encampment and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment. In hunting societies, there tends to be a tremendous pressure not to create internal strife. Direct criticism is completely taboo. In Inupiaq, the language of the Inuit, there are no swear words. You express your disapproval by silence. And the reason for that is very clear. In an Athabascan Dene hunting society, if we are an extended family group, say 3 men, 3 women, and children, if I don't get along with my brother-in-law and his brother, and I am forced to leave on my own, that night my children have a 2/3 less chance to eat. And so it's not like the darkness of the human heart doesn't manifest itself in indigenous culture. I lived a long time with the Warani in the forests of the Amazon in Ecuador and I was with men who had been involved in spearing raids. And at one point, 54% of the adult mortality, male mortality, was due to them spearing each other. So we shouldn't romanticize um, indigenous people. But at the same time, as we struggle with notions like virtue, it's important to remember that these words, virtue, have different meanings through time. If you go back to the Constitution, the famous line about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the founding fathers of America didn't mean contentment when they used the word happiness. On the contrary, what they meant was a happy life was a virtuous life. It was a life in which you had deliberately and consciously attempted to be a better person. And if you look back on the early letters between Franklin and Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison, George Washington, these individuals were heavily schooled in the classics, and they were referencing all the great works of the Greeks and the Romans to each other all the time. And they had daily practices that were conceived to enhance virtue. Jefferson had a whole plan of action that he shared with people, which books you should read, what you should do. Get up 2 hours before dawn, read 2 hours before you do anything. I mean, these guys were incredibly disciplined, but they were very, very conscious in the same way that they constructed an entirely new political system and gave birth to an entirely new kind of country. They were equally concerned about giving birth to an entirely new kind of human being. Now, they did live like all people in a realm of contradictions and slavery, and slavery being the hideous and the obvious record. I mean, evidence of that. But this is what they meant by virtue and happiness, and it was like being conscious. And I found, I'm 70 now, and I have the same energy and idealism I had when I was 20. And I think I have that for one simple bit of advice that my father gave me, who was not a fancy man, but he was a deeply wonderful man and a kind man. And whereas my mom was Christian and shared that hope that if we just tried hard enough, good would vanquish evil, Christ would triumph over the fallen archangel, the devil. My father, broken by the war, had no such illusions. And he used to say to me, son, there's good and evil in the world. Take your pick and get on with it. And what he was really saying is something I learned from Carroll in all our travels in the Himalayas. It's the Buddhist path. The destination is not a place, but a state of mind. If you don't expect to vanquish evil, you never get disappointed when you lose, and you have no excuse to stop trying. My father said, good and evil walk side by side, just like light and darkness. You'll never vanquish the dark, but you can illuminate the dawn. And that has given me the very purpose of my life. I have no expectations. You win some things, you lose some things. You try to be again in that Buddhist notion. Again, I owe everything I really understand about Buddhism to Carroll and friends of ours like Mathieu. But you really do try to be that mountain that the wind can't shake, right? I didn't know what that concept meant when I was young, but I certainly understand it now.
Wonderful. Thank you. There's 100 things we could dive into on that I could have 100 more questions, but I wanted to make sure I opened up to the floor as well. But I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Nick to moderate the Q&A. Nick is an extraordinary educator. He has been on the Plus Wonder journey with us from the very beginning, just an extraordinary human being as well.
Carroll and Wade, wow, this was 30 minutes of complete kind of jaw-dropping awe on my side of the fence. I was an anthropology teacher, a social and cultural anthropology teacher for a number of years at a world traveling high school. And so you in 30 minutes just brought to life so much of my anthropology course, from the Guarani to the Sarawak, and all of what you talked about with reciprocity. This is an amazing experience. One thing that I wanted to ask: what rituals have you seen in the groups that you've worked with and walked with that do foster that sense of community? Obviously, there's a lot of those textbooks examples that I know of, but I'd love to hear from you guys. What are those rituals that maybe we can modify in our contemporary world or in our contemporary context across the call here? What have you guys seen?
And so many. I mean, in the Northwest Amazon, the Barasana and the Makuna, their most profound insight is the idea that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. And the shaman is not a priest or a physician. He's more like a diplomat who maintains a dialogue with the natural world. And sometimes he acts as a nuclear engineer who has to go to the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. But in the Andes, for example, in Chinchero near Cusco, once each year, the fastest young boy is given the honor of becoming a woman. And dressed as a woman, he leads all able-bodied men on a run, but it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, run down 2,000 feet, run to 16,000 feet, and fall to the Sacred Valley and cross two more soaring Andean ridges. And you're running the boundaries of the community, which is marked by holy mounds of earth, where the Wailaka must spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop. But what happens is it's so arduous that you go into the day as an individual, but through sacrifice, which means in Latin to make sacred, you emerge as a single pulse, a single community that has reaffirmed your sense of both belonging and obligation to your landscape. And those localized rituals in the Andes become pan-Andean at events like the Coyariti, where tens of thousands of indigenous people from all over the southern Andes converge on a sacred valley, and they bring the crosses from their communities up into the heights of the mountain to be planted in the ice fields of the glaciers to absorb the power of Pachamama in the shadow of Ausangati, the most sacred of the uh, peaks of the Inca. And then after 2 days, the Pablitos retrieve the crosses, bring them down, and return to their communities. And then they bring ice from the glaciers back to the communities as well, so that even those elders who cannot take part physically in the pilgrimage can be part of the sacred cycle of the divine. I mean, a final example, the Arawakos and the Kogi literally believe that their prayers maintain the cosmic balance of the world. They call themselves the Elder Brothers. They are ruled to this day in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia by a ritual priesthood. And the training for the priesthood involves 18 years in the environs of the sacred temple, whereby the acolyte is taught the values of the community, which include this Baroque array of rituals deemed to be necessary to maintain the harmonic balance of the earth. And this is not hippie ethnography. And after that incredible training, the initiate is led on a journey to the heart of the world. And having never seen a mountain or a horizon or even the full luminosity of the sun across the landscape, suddenly the world is revealed to him in all of its stunning beauty. And as he goes to the ice and brings products from the ice to the sea and from the sea back to the community, the priest who has trained him essentially is saying the whole journey, you see, it's as I've told you, it's that beautiful. It's yours to protect. Now, those people, by the way, live 2 hours by plane from Miami Beach.
I would just say it's so powerful to just reaffirm what Wade's Beautiful Things is. Really simple elements. Reconnecting with elements is really, really important. And also in the body, the somatic experience of rituals. I lived in Nepal, the Himalayas, over 30 years. Chema is a traditional Newar ceremony. There's a community ceremony when someone has transgressed. And then there's also, the Buddhists have traditionally, as we have greater self-awareness of ourselves. And when we transgress our own, what's known as prajnaparada, or crimes against our own wisdom, our own innate wisdom, so it is to have greater awareness of that. So I would say, look also at the life cycles. I've learned so much of understanding what it means to be human from birth all the way to death, and also reconnecting us to this animate earth in pilgrimage, as Wade so beautifully described. There's nothing more powerful than pilgrimage, the visceral experience of pilgrimage, to remember who we are and why we are, and connecting us in the most deepest of ways, and doing that in community. Very powerful.
Beautiful, beautifully put, both of you. Thanks for that response. I think Rodrigo is able to come off mute now. Rodrigo, go ahead.
Hello, guys. Hello, Jean. Great to see you again, and awesome learning from everything Carroll and Wade and Nick and that you guys have been saying. My question is related to Mexico. In this case, we have President López Obrador, who right now is really advocating and moving ahead with the Tren Maya. He's known to support the Indigenous community, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the development of the Tren Maya may impact the local communities, the biodiversity, and what are your thoughts with this massive project that is underway?
Yeah, I was just down in the Petén in Guatemala. It's interesting how this development paradigm ends up sort of killing the goose that laid the golden egg. I mean, these mega projects that are conceived to bring more visitors, more income to local communities, they often will end up corroding the very values that visitors seek when they travel. I mean, um, the classic example, even in a way more egregious than this massive expenditure in Mexico, is Peru's ongoing plan that's being realized as I speak, to place an international airport right beside Chinchero, outside of Cusco. And the only reason for this is that people want the land of the old airport, which has now become extremely valuable as Cusco has grown and enveloped the old airport. And and there, the main sites in and around Cusco, Machu Picchu notably, are already over capacity in terms of visitations. And this new airport is being installed right on the most beautiful land, adjacent to the most traditional community in the entire region. And the irony of it is that the purpose supposedly was to allow international flights to land directly to Cusco, avoiding Lima. But of course, the hotel owners in Lima won't tolerate that. So the compromise has been that the only international flights that will land at the new airport are, in fact, from within Latin America. And the international flights will still have to land in Lima so that the hotel owners in Lima will still get their cut of the action. So you have this sort of insane public policy, driven strictly by greed, that has the real risk of compromising the very qualities that create the charisma of the nation. I mean, the great thing about Cusco is that despite its growth, particularly in the wake of the insecurity during the Sendero Luminosa terrorism era, it quadrupled, at least in size, but it's maintained its kind of core charisma. It still is a beautiful, beautiful place. And one of the great advantages of Cusco was that alrededor de Cusco, you had all these amazing communities that that could be visited, and communities that had come to terms with tourism in a very positive way. And now that's all been just blown out of the window by this egregious project. And I suspect that, you know, these mega projects can begin with the best of intentions, but invariably they're all about growth, economy, money, and that rarely is conducive to the kind of values that travelers are interested in. You know, Tom Lovejoy, an old friend of mine who passed away, used to say, anyone who thinks that economy triumphs over or trumps ecology should try counting their money with a plastic bag tied around their head. You know, and so I think it's you know, I don't know what the outcome will ultimately be, but I don't think those sites needed to be opened up. I mean, part of the allure of these distant points of wonder is the struggle to find them, to get to them. You know, it's the journey counts, you know, and it's like E.O. Wilson said, you know, in the 1940s, you know, when my professor went to Colombia, it was a one-way ticket. You didn't know when you were coming back. And it was like that for me in 1974 when I went. Now, young students go down and do 2 weeks of field work and get back in time for their cousin's bar mitzvah. You know, so the nature of travel has changed so much, but we don't need to accelerate it, especially if it implies violation of natural habitats.
Thank you so much.
I think there's some alignment to Cameron's question in the chat about living in this world that lives in a tension between man-made and natural ecosystems. So knowing that we've got these incredible works and then incredible natural world that we live in, how do the world's builders create and implement those regenerative design principles that work together? Like I'm thinking biophilic design, and how are we reincorporating that in the 21st century while honoring those on from the land in which we build? I love that question, Cameron.
Oh, I'm so grateful that you asked that question, and that you even used the word biophilic. Actually, yeah, I think that's what we can be creating biophilic virtues. I think is really where we want to be heading in terms of linguistically. I'm involved in when we look at the future of food, clothing, and shelter. The materials we're living right now through a material revolution, because we have to, in our radically rethinking how to be on this planet. So that means a cosmological reframe of our story, but it also means a material reframe as well. And with this, what's so exciting, to be honest, like during COVID, I've never been more excited. It was the best antidote to the gloom and despair of so-called Anthropocene, if we can try to be moving to what's known as symbiosis, or the symbiocene of how we work with it. So we're moving towards circularity, moving towards radically reconsidering. I have friends who work with microbes right now, and they're working, and we're looking at how to make building materials, so feeding agricultural waste, for example, to microbes that then will be creating the concrete of our future. So actually, the food, clothing, shelter, very similar. They're looking at it now. Synthetic biology, that's its a whole can of worms, complexities in itself. Not to be simplified. I'm not necessarily what you would call a technological utopianist, but I would say that there's very exciting, dramatically exciting, and especially looking at recycling, because we have created so much. You know, right now we have created enough clothes to clothe the next 6 generations. Right now on the planet, we could stop for 6 generations making more clothes. We don't need any more. Why? Because 70% is made from petroleum, and now the petroleum industries are overproducing. Our size of our closets have expanded. We're drowning in our waste. It's like WALL-E on steroids. We're living in. So as we start thinking, what will we build with? The recycling, the creative reuse of things becomes very, very exciting when we look at that. And I'm really going in deep into the issues of biodegradability. Do you make something to last forever? Do you make something that actually purposely doesn't last long? And understanding these materials. So it's like we're returning back to where our ancestors were, and where, yes, a lot of Indigenous cultures, which is the deep seeing, the deep looking. That's what shamans did. That's what magicians do, into the natural world, the biomimicry, to try to understand. So I think biomimicry will also influence how we build in the future.
Great, thank you. I see another question from Amy in the chat asking, what are some of the areas of reciprocity and ritual in our Western weird culture and society that you see and believe we could build from and make connections to the beautiful and moving rituals as you described? So kind of that transition of ritual and reciprocity.
I really appreciate that question, and Wade, I'll let you afterwards. But that's really where I am in my life right now. Is after 30 years in Nepal, immersed in ritual worlds. For 30 years studying Buddhism, living in traditional communities, and now I'm in the U.S. and I'm like asking that question of how can I relate this within our own world. So that's where I again say, look at the elements and look at life rights, so space and time, and how do you want to honor that? How do you want to honor where you live in that location or that ecosystem that upholds you? So in community. So for example, one of our most favorite festivals that I have brought over with me is we have during in the fall, it's called Ma Puja. It's a Newar Puja, worship of the divine self. And what we do is we take up all of our our carpets, and we make mandalas out of all of the harvest of that time. So from your area, location, and we make it into an art project. Everyone makes their own beautiful in that moment, and then we go around and we honor and worship each person there. And we do it creatively: sound, music, scent, all the five senses, play. So my main point is to incorporate and utilize play. Do not be too rigid. And find your own. Every family has its own rituals. Think Thanksgiving, you already have them. And how do we then transform? Like Thanksgiving has a complicated history. How do we have a feast we all need to eat that includes more, maybe the non-human world as well? We are in a revolution, and I would please contact me. I'd like to continue this conversation, because everyone can do this. Utilize art and creativity, which is part of the human spirit, in creating rituals that have profound meaning and purpose for you.
Thanks, Carol. I think we actually have someone on the call from Paint the World. So I think you are a kindred spirit of that organization. I have one last question, maybe tying back. You guys are experts at bridging that divide, of crossing into the unknown. And one of our core pieces of our toolkits is really about building trust and creating trust. So what strategies have you found most effective in building trust and rapport with those people or groups that you have a diverse cultural background from? How do you make that jump from I'm a foreigner to becoming the Mamo Occidental, as you said earlier, Wade? How do you make that transition happen?
It's not complicated. It's this very same traits of character that would make you welcome at Carol's house at Thanksgiving. I mean, everybody thinks there's this. It's amazing to me how people approach that kind of cultural interface with such trepidation, and sometimes even with fear. The same qualities that you break down. I mean, the dance of culture, which is so interesting, is that for all the differences that we see and celebrate between different cultures, every culture has the same adaptive imperatives. Everybody has to have kids, has to find a way to consistently couple, has to deal with the agony of growing old, the inexorable mystery that death implies. I mean, and how cultures deal with those universalities defines their kind of worldview. But there is not just differences between cultures. There's this wonderful commonality, which is what you want to try to tap into. And I always say that it's never bravado. It's empathy and love. It's the same things that would make me welcome at your house. You know, good manners, a willingness to eat what's put in front of me, sleep where I'm asked to sleep, um, um, self-deprecating humor, kindness, decency. I mean, all the traits that we were raised to believe were important. And I know it's hard for me to kind of get it because I've been, you know, alone in culture since I was 14 years old. And in many ways, I've come to understand that I'm more comfortable in a culture that's not my own than in my own. I mean, anthropologists are sometimes accused of loving every culture but their own, and some of maybe it's some of that, but it's just that there's an amazing freedom to be in a place where you don't have to perform, where there are no expectations, where you already are a little bit idiotic, and so your idiocies go unnoticed. And that dance of culture. I mean, there's nothing that that warms my heart more than when I feel that barrier break down, and there's that smooth kind of slipping away, and one goes from being an outsider to becoming, in a sense, not just a guest, but a welcome guest, you know. And that's really why I was drawn to anthropology. You know, when I was a little boy, I grew up in Quebec at a time of the two solitudes, and the French and English were at war with each other, virtually didn't speak to each other. And my neighborhood was an Anglophone neighborhood, plunked like a carbuncle in the back of an old Francophone village that went back to the 17th century. And there was literally a boulevard, Cartier Boulevard, that divided the two worlds. And my mother would send me to get cigarettes or milk at a little corner store run by, by an elderly Francophone Quebecois couple. And I would sit on their stoop and look across at the age of 5, that boulevard. And I'd think, wow, I mean, right across this road, there's another language, another religion, another way of life. And why can't I cross this road? And I've been crossing that road all my life.
Humor, authenticity, warmth and kindness, and awareness. Pay attention. I think, you know, where that's the art of really paying attention to something other than our phones, but to other people is really
Respect.
quite respect is so important, and a beautiful, with humility, respect, very simple, and it's such a beautiful thing to experience, and to be to have the privilege and honor to be in other people's spaces and to feel that. It's just,
And you know, and you know, Carol, so you know, sometimes it's just the most obvious things, like food. Food is power, right? And there have been, you know, with indigenous communities, the food is generally very fresh and very clean and so on, of course. But you know, in certain border frontier areas, because of sanitation, you can be offered a plate of food by a impoverished family, and you can be pretty certain that you're going to get giardia or amoebic dysentery or some kind of gastrointestinal um, uh, illness from the. But you must always eat the food, because you can always treat the illness, but you can never rekindle that human bond broken by a gesture that says that your food's not good enough for me, knowing especially that that food may have been coming off the table where it would have normally been going to the kids, right? So you know, part of it is just gestures. Like when I worked in Haiti, studying voodoo and became initiated into the Bizango Champouel, the secret societies, the most common thing that was said about me, the question I always got was, "Qui qualité bronsayo?" What kind of white are you anyway? You know, and the voodoo priest would say, you know, no, li pas blanc, li indien. He's not a white, he's an Indian. And there was just they had to do that to put a frame around how strange I seemed to them, because I was so unintimidated by the power and the wonder of that religious faith. It was enchanting to me. And I think everywhere I've gone, that's something I've been so proud of, is that I don't know, I think because I started doing this so young, I really have this kind of, I don't have a lot of skills in life, but one thing I do know is I've got antenna, and I can go into any cultural scene almost anywhere in the world and kind of like, almost like an X-ray. I know Carol has this attribute as well. Just sort of sense what one is supposed to do. You know, what are the protocols? What are the boundaries? and that can be tactile, it can be verbal, it can be um, any number of things. But it's that dance which I think draws us to travel and draws us to the wonder of culture.
One of the things that I really love is that not only when you were asking earlier, what do we learn from other cultures, but is in that reciprocity, because through giving we become great. So for me, it's sort of like scratching my nose, or having lived for 30 years. Everyone jokes when in the U.S. because now I've moved back after 30 years, and guest is God, as we say in the Himalayas. And so as a result, the giving part is a joy and an honor. And people will be there saying, "Wait, why, Carroll, do you always bring a gift when you come? You don't need to." And I said, that's just what we do. It's not even, so the joy of creating deeper bonds through giving is and making that a part of who and what we are, and that can be lived here in our culture.
Yeah,
Just
there's
bring
this
it home with you.
Sorry, Carol, but there's a wonderful affirmation in that connection made with a stranger. I mean, Gary Snyder has a wonderful poem where he's walking alone in the Sierra and he comes across a couple. And the kind of the last line of the poem is, it's moments like these that allow me to live. In other words, these human connections aren't trivial, and they can't be forced. But when they happen, there's a kind of affirmation of our commonality, of our connectivity, that I find just so moving. I mean, one time Chris Rainier, our good friend, who we did so many adventures with at the National Geographic, just a beautiful man. Actually, I love him. I just love him like a brother. And Chris took me to an ancient salt mine north of Timbuktu, a place he knew well. And as we went up to the mine, it was a biblical scene. I mean, Isa Muhammad, who was with us, said, I wouldn't bring my wife here. And I asked the smugglers where they came from. There are no countries here. And we met a man who had been broken in the mine, trapped there through debt peonage for decades, and he was never going to escape. And his debt was roughly the price of a dinner for four in New York. So Chris and I gave him the money, and we never knew what happened to him because a sandstorm just swept through the mine and enveloped him in a kind of haze of yellow mist. And then as we drove south back to Timbuktu, we came upon a caravan that we had seen going as we went north, and they were coming south already, and they had run out of water. And well, what actually had happened is a rare rainstorm had dampened the salt, and if the salt gets wet, it breaks and loses all value. So they were forced to sit still in the desert, 200 kilometers from the nearest well, and they were down to one single liter of water. And as we came upon them, one of them could be seen on the horizon in a mirage with one camel going off to try to find a basin of water, a place they could dig for water. And as we came upon them, what did they do with that last liter of water? They immediately kindled a twig fire and brewed us tea, honoring the Bedouin adage that you will kill the last goat that keeps your child alive to feed a wandering stranger, because you never know when you'll be that stranger, cold, hungry, in need of shelter, coming in out of the darkness. And I remember Chris and I were sitting beside each other as Muhammad poured that first cup of tea. And I don't know what was going on in Chris's head, but in my head, and I suspect in his, was this feeling like this is why we travel, because these are the moments that allow us to find hope.
And that's a beautiful way to end this conversation. And I know Chris is actually on this call, I think, as well, Wade. I think I saw him come in. So, and I just
Hi,
can't
Chris.
thank you. And a huge thank you to Nick as well, and to the whole team, to Lindsay, to Bree, to Karen, to Anna. And I just want to deeply thank you, Carol and Wade, because I think for all of us, this last hour has been this bubble of love and wonder and awe. And I can see I love some of this chat that's coming through. And there was a conversation about crossing the road. And I think what you also illuminated is dancing and playing in the middle of the road as well. And how do we do that more as human beings? So I just want to thank you for giving us this time for an hour, but also just for what you do in this world. And I think most importantly, for who you both are in this world. I know for me, and I think for many of us on this call, you have been these bright lights of hope in how you live and how you show up. And so I just wanted to say an immense thanks. And again, to everyone on this call, I know Carroll and Wade would love to partner with you in some of the stuff they're doing, as well as Plus Wonder, to think about how we spark these connections of love and purpose and meaning in our lives. So a massive thanks to all of you. And again, just massive thanks, Carroll and Wade, for your time, which I know is so precious.
Well, thanks, Jean, and thanks, Carroll, and thanks everybody.
Thank you all. Yeah, it's only with creating community in small ways and the long, big trade communities across the planet. Let's be more like mycelium and spread the connections.
Wonderful. Maybe next time we can all meet at the base of Pando.
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.